good afternoon, everybody. This is Michael Herbert, Ashland Town Manager. We're here for another episode of Clock Town Chronicles, our opportunity to get into depth into things that are happening in and to Ashland, Massachusetts. This is episode 3. Previous episodes, we've been able to kind of go through a 10-year retrospective of the town. And then our last one was related to the comprehensive plan. And we're actually going to continue the planning theme in episode 3 today. And we're going to talk about municipal planning. And specifically, we're going to get a little bit into a specific type of project known as a 40B project. But before we get into the subject too deep, I want to introduce my two guests here today. First, to my left is Peter Matchak. Peter is the town planner here in the town of Ashland, Massachusetts. I almost said town of Massachusetts. Yes, I have lived here more than half my life, folks. And then to my right, we have John Trefethen, who is chair of the Zoning Board of Appeals. Gentlemen, thank you both for being willing to be here today and answer some questions and tell us a little bit about things that are happening in your world. So
thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, we're happy to be here, Michael.
Absolutely. So yeah, typical free-flowing conversation, and we've got Melissa Hayes here who's going to keep us on track, and we'll have the time clock because I think between the three of us, we've been known to go a little bit long sometimes when we get started. Pete's looking at me like, what are you talking about? Speak for yourself, pal. But Pete, why don't we start with you, man? Pete and I have known each other for years, and Pete's always been interested in planning. But Pete, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got into planning, municipal planning, and how you ended up here in the town of Ashland?
Sure, thanks, Mike. So yeah, I've been a municipal planner for going on 10 years now. And as I say, I grew up in Massachusetts on the North Shore, up in Danvers. And I went to Westfield State College, started about 2003. And I studied regional planning at Westfield State College, and did also kind of was at that time working through GIS, Geographical Information Systems, kind of learning the trade. That was my undergrad. Then when I got out of undergrad at Westfield State, 2008, recession hit, and then I kind of dovetailed back into graduate school.
So perfect time to go.
It was a perfect time to get out.
Right in the recession.
Yeah, perfect time to get out of school and start looking for a job. But it suited me well, right? I went to Westfield. I went back to school, doing GIS work at Salem State, which obviously was local, and gaining experiences. At that time, I was also volunteering. Had a great opportunity. Had some great friends in planning.
Yeah.
Kate Day, who was a senior planner up in Danvers, was a great person that I interacted with a lot. And at that time, I actually volunteered on the Danvers Rail Trail, which was a way for me to kind of get some municipal experience, kind of going. And that was a great project for the town of Danvers and for where I was, in my life. And then GIS, you're sitting behind a computer, sitting and clicking, I always say. Yeah. And there wasn't too much personal, connections going on. You're kind of, and I didn't want to be stuck behind the computer my entire life. And so at that point, I shifted gears and I went out to UMass Amherst, and I got into a graduate program out there for regional planning, landscape architecture, which was a great thing that I did.
Landscape architecture?
It was
you had that part of your program was landscape architecture?
Part of the program is landscape architecture. Oh. Yeah, but my focus was regional planning. But to tell you the truth, some days when I was when I was sick of writing papers, I always took a landscape architecture class to focus in on grading. Wow. Very interesting topics that landscape architects take.
See, I had no idea about this about Pete.
Yeah. And then, I got out, and then, I've been practicing planning at the municipal level for 10 years. My first stop was in Hanover, then in Cohasset on the South Shore. As a North Shore guy, I didn't think I would ever. I always joked around. I fell in the draft to the South Shore, and but I met some great people down there. Still good friends to this day, who I respect highly, and I still stay in touch with. And then about 5 years, a little over 5 years ago, I joined Ashland and I was hired by you, and it's been a lot. It's been busy, as you told me 5 years ago. Ashland, downtown Ashland would not be the same place it was 5 years ago, and I would say this is they delivered on that promise with the renovations to the downtown and the renovations on Pond Street, and obviously the projects that we're working on. And the state is actually obviously in a different place after the pandemic. Planning's a little bit different too. So but yeah, right now we got the comprehensive plan going. And obviously a couple big projects coming through, but we've also dealt with some really big projects, complex projects.
Yeah, for sure.
I would say, the completion into the final permitting stage and seeing the final phase construction of Village of the Americas was a big part.
That's 100 Chestnut Street.
100 Chestnut Street, the 174 units and 10,500 square feet of commercial. I think that's that was a real interesting project to work on, to permit, to understand. It's been a fun ride these last 5 years, but
it just seems like 10 sometimes.
Yeah, they're busy. I'll say that. They're busy.
Yeah, we try to keep you busy a little bit. And John, how about you? You're here. You work with the town of Ashland in a volunteer capacity as a committee member. So what?
I'm the only one here that's not being paid.
That is, well, I did tell you I'd give you a couple bucks for this, right? Didn't I?
No.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I'll at least buy you a coffee or something.
Food is good.
It's the least I could do. But John, why don't you just let us know a little bit about, why you were interested in volunteering for the town of Ashland, and what made you decide like the zoning board of appeals was kind of the direction you wanted to go in?
Well, I was a retired attorney. I never practiced in the field of land use, zoning, or anything. I was looking for something to do, and it was actually a project that had come before the zoning board of appeals, a project in my neighborhood, and I had spoken at the project in opposition to the project, and notwithstanding what I thought was a compelling argument, the ZBA approved the project.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe I can add something to the process. And I filled out a talent bank form, and I think there was an opening, for an associate member at the time.
Yeah.
And
the ZBA has 3 full members.
3 full members and up
to 4.
Up to 4 is a maximum. And at the moment we are, I think we're at 3.
Okay.
And I was interviewed over the phone by one of the select board members at the time to sort of make sure that I understood the possibilities of conflict of interest and things of that nature. And I said I did. And I was appointed, and I came on as an associate member for a year or two, I think, and then a position as a full member opened, and I was appointed to that. And that was a number of years ago now.
Okay. Well, and here you are.
Yes.
It's been through a number of different
going
projects.
strong.
For sure. So, John, I'll just start hitting you with the hard questions right away, because you brought up something that, I wanted to lead into. And you said, one of the ways you got involved, or how you got involved, is that there was a project that was kind of affecting your neighborhood. And you went to the ZBA and you made some arguments against that project, or maybe some particulars regarding that project. And the ZBA still found that it was important to move forward with that project. Let me ask you, being on the ZBA now, do you understand? Well, let me reframe this a bit. One of the things that we hear sometimes is that people, they go to either the planning board or ZBA or the select board, and they speak out against projects. And then a lot of times those projects move forward anyway, maybe with some conditions that have been impacted by the comments that the boards have received, but, maybe not. But sometimes it's hard to understand or help explain to people why some projects move forward when they don't want to see it move forward in the first place. Being in the chair position or being on the ZBA, can you understand, do you have a little bit of a better perspective now about projects in general?
Well, I think, the short answer to that is yes. It was more the process and the matter that sort of caught my attention that I thought could have been improved, and that's why I wanted to become involved. And I keep that in the back of my mind now as we come before matters. I mean, the ZBA, unlike the planning board, we're really an appellate organization, as it were, is that the reason people come before us is because they want some change. What they want to do isn't allowed by right under the zoning bylaws, and they want either a special permit or a variance to allow them to do what they would like to do.
Right.
And in facing issues like that, one of the things that the ZBA tries to do at the very beginning, and it starts with the planning department when the applicants meet with Peter or Alvaro and review the process, and it continues with the ZBA, is explain to people not only what the process is, but what the ZBA can and can't do, and what we have to find in order to grant what they want to do. And that's not something that, the average layperson knows. Most of the people that come before us on special permits don't have an attorney with them, so they're proceeding pro se, and it's a new process for them. But I think communication and trying to get them to understand and help them understand what our limitations are as a board is helpful,
Right.
Although they may not be pleased with the ultimate decision.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think people appreciate others who take the opportunity to explain to them kind of what your constraints are and what you're working on and what you have to work with. But you brought up a couple of technical terms, things like special permits and variances. And Pete, I'll turn to you. Maybe you can give the average listener just kind of an explanation of what those things are, especially as it relates to zoning itself, and kind of maybe just a high-level overview of what zoning is.
Yeah, so obviously zoning kind of goes back to the turn of the century, mid-19th century, I think it's 1954. The Supreme Court kind of puts it in play through a rule in Euclid v. Ambler, which is a famous Ohio case. But zoning is there from an original statute point of view, is to protect health, safety, and welfare across the board. State of Massachusetts enacts the Zoning Act, I believe it's 1952. Most cities and towns in Massachusetts adopt, such as Ashland, to Ashland, we adopt zoning in 1954. And so that comes under Statute 40A in Mass General Law. And there's a couple of things to look at, right? There's the special permits, which is, obviously a special request regarding a use that can, in some towns, depending on the organizational structure, that could go to the Zoning Board of Appeals or it could go to the Planning Board. Across the board, it differs, and I think it's kind of when those zoning bylaws are updated or drafted, the organization or those hearings are held by separate boards, right? Variances in Massachusetts are always held and granted by the Zoning Board of Appeals. That's under Section 10 of Mass General Law 40A.
So if you want to do something that's not within the zoning,
correct,
you need to go seek variance.
And so in Massachusetts and in typically in most communities, the state and communities have adopted the ability to grant dimensional variances, right? Ashland is in the Zoning Board of Appeals is allowed to grant dimensional variances, not use variances.
And what do you mean by dimensional variances?
Dimensional variances are regarding setbacks, right? How far you can build in relationship to the street, your side setbacks, your rear setback. Those are the variances that can be granted. Those have to be linked to shape of your lot, topography, soil, and hardship, which should be not financial, but in some cases it is financial.
What about lot
reasoning?
size? Is lot size?
Lot size would be a variance. That's also a dimensional. And so those are the two elements. And then obviously applying Chapter 40B, the Zoning Board of Appeals also does hear comprehensive permits, which is a different process in its own. But for a whole, the zoning bylaws are there to help organize land uses and protect the health, safety, and welfare of residents. As a quick summary.
Yeah, I think, when people hear the word zoning, it can be kind of this mysterious, almost mythical thing, right? And really, I think, like you said, Pete, zoning is really kind of where that intersection of where property rights kind of meet with the health, well-being, and safety of the community in general, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yes. Yeah.
And so zoning says, you can do things like, okay, if you want to, in a section of town that's zone Res A, residential A, which is a specific zone, like you have to have a lot size of
30,000 square
feet,
Yep.
right? You can only build a single family home or maybe a duplex. Your setbacks have to be, 30 feet off the front, 20 feet off the side, things like that. So it's basically the rules, kind of the constraints that you have to build within.
Correct. Zoning creates your zone, what I would call your building envelope on your typical residential A lot. A residential A lot, 30,000 square feet. And I would say across the board in Massachusetts, that's probably your most common lot size. It's a big, 30,000 square feet is a big lot, right? And I think that's a discussion point. But typically across the board, within subdivision development, you're looking at 150 feet of frontage on a roadway, and you're looking for 30,000 square feet of space.
So, I think, in the simplest terms, let's just say you're a homeowner or you're a landowner, right? You go in and you buy a lot of land, a lot, and it's, zoned residential A. If what you want to build, which is a single family home, meets the zoning, all you need to do is just go to the building commissioner and pull a building permit.
That's correct. Yeah.
You can start building.
100%. Yep. For any residential single family house on any, vacant piece of property, right? And meanwhile, those are hard to come by these days.
Right.
Vacant pieces of property, a buildable lot. Yeah. I think, the setbacks or the zoning requirements or the dimensional requirements create the building envelope, and you as a landowner have the ability to file for a building permit, and you don't have to do anything with the zoning board or the planning board, and if you're in with proximity of wetlands, that's a different story because you may have to go see the conservation department. But if you have septic or versus sewer, another question, then you got to go talk to the Board of Health or the DPW regarding how do you connect to the infrastructure. But yeah, no, you do have the property right. It's within your bundle of sticks, as sometimes lawyers kind of relate to.
No offense there, John. No lawyer jokes.
Former lawyer, so it's okay.
Okay.
To apply for a building permit.
And then, with some of these larger projects that people see, some of these apartment buildings, multifamily buildings, some of the condos that were built back in the 80s, there's a little bit more involved of a planning process, right?
Yeah, 100%. When you're talking about a big project, right? You're talking about, over on Chestnut Street, for example, right? The Village of the Americas, the final phase, the mixed-use phase.
The one's being constructed,
The one's under construction right now. That was permitted through the planning board, not the ZBA, due to the zoning. But they have to go through site plan review, it's called, right? So it's a little bit more complicated, right? You have to look at the number of parking spots, the ratio of parking to the number of units, the residential versus the commercial. Most importantly, safety. access for the fire department. Can their trucks maneuver the site, moving around the site? And then what's become more, increasingly important, not just at the town level, but from the state level, is stormwater and stormwater review. And to make sure that whatever you build, whatever water you displace that used to functionally dissipate through that site, can now be mechanically and engineered to stay on that site, to infiltrate through that land area, and you're not passing that water, that sheet flow, over to an adjoining property. That's now against the law. And so therefore, whatever you build on your site, you have to maintain on your site, and you have to make sure that you have the engineering capacity or the stormwater capacity to make all these things work. And so as you develop property, any property, there's a lot of things at work, that a developer has to look at.
Yeah. And so I think it's important that we have this kind of initial discussion about zoning and what it is and kind of what these projects are and what kind of process they have to go through, because, in the time that we have left, we want to just cover a specific type of project called a 40B project. And Ashland has seen, if you've been paying attention out there, you've seen that we've had 2 40B projects essentially come across our desk. I'm using air quotes there. And 40B projects are, they can be pretty involved from an administrative and a bureaucratic process, but they are very, very, very controversial projects. And Pete, now that we've talked a little bit about zoning and what zoning is and what zoning covers, why don't you explain to us what 40B is and what a 40B project is?
Sure. So a 40B project, to sum it up, comes under it's known as a 40B because that's the state statute that was invoked to create this permanent avenue, I would call it, right? And the permit, from a functional standpoint, is called a comprehensive permit. And Chapter 40B law, the legislation, dates back to, I believe, the mid-1960s. Is that correct?
69.
69, right after the Fair Housing Act kind of gets passed at the federal level. And the goal behind Chapter 40B is to develop, quote unquote, affordable housing, right? Now, with a 40B project, 25% of those units have to be deed restricted for anybody making up to or less than the area median income, which is known as AMI. That's a census-driven statistic, and we in Ashland are part of the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy census metropolitan area, right? And so that's just kind of one of the things to remember. But Chapter 40B, if a developer is proposing a 40B project, a comprehensive permit, they have to go to the state and get what's known as a letter of eligibility, and then they can file with the local zoning board of appeals. What Chapter 40B does is, if a developer is proposing this and the development and creation of affordable housing, right? The developer gets to create what's known as a list of has to submit what's known as a list of waivers, right? And they almost sidestep a community zoning bylaws. Regarding height, densities, scale in some instances, right? And so that's kind of what's at play here.
Yeah.
What does the town get in return, right? Well, Chapter 40B, another subsection of the law, requires all towns in Massachusetts, cities and towns in Massachusetts, and demands all cities and towns in Massachusetts is to have 10% of their housing stock be affordable, right? So with a 40B project, you're only creating 25% affordability at a deed restricted level. However, the community gets to add all units onto what's known as the subsidized housing inventory.
Right.
SHI for short. And so for simple mathematical numbers right here, if a project, say, of 100 units of rental units is proposed, 25 units have to be deed restricted for people making up to or less than 80% of the area median income. And then all 100 units of that project is added to the town's subsidized housing inventory.
And that's for rental projects.
And that's for rental projects.
You only have to add the 25.
Right. Correct. And just right now, just for a matter of the conversation, the town of Ashland is at 5.62% affordable housing.
And it's interesting because, so in 1969, the reason the legislature created Chapter 40B is because suburban communities were actually passing zoning and implementing zoning that kept multifamily housing and affordable housing from being built. And so the legislature said, okay, well, this is a statewide issue, and so we're going to pass this law that essentially allows developers, like you said, Pete, if they propose building something that has 25% affordable, 25% of the units are affordable, they get to bypass that town zoning, so things like density and stuff like that. And so that's why you see in some communities, Ashland included, but this happens statewide and certainly in Metro West, where you see some of these very, very dense, large, tall projects being built in places that are you don't see those.
Yeah, you may not think they would be appropriate for that site. However, a community has to provide 10% affordable, and so over time, communities have to put. Obviously, I always say the community has to put the wave on the bow, right, and figure it out. But also, in approving a project of that nature, right, the town gets to increase their housing inventory, right?
Exactly.
And the whole goal of the state is to get 10% affordability, right? Now, once a community hits 10% affordability, you enter what's known as safe harbor, right? So then actually you can deny outright any 40B project there is that comes across the table, right? Through a development standpoint. And so all communities are striving to meet, their goal is to get 10% affordable, 10% on the subsidized housing inventory.
Right. So I think that's a good explanation. And that 10% number is important because you can, like you said, if community gets that, you can deny 40B projects that, come to your community if you want to. So before we get into actually some of the new 40B projects that are being proposed, Ashland has, three that I think that have either been built or were proposed and permitted. Let's see. So we've got the Robert Hill Way project, which was 64 units of affordable housing off of Independence. We had the UGC project that was permitted a few years ago, and we had Ashland Woods, 60 units that was approved and built on basically on the Hopkinton line. And then we also had 133 West Union Street, otherwise known as the Valentine property, that actually got a comprehensive permit. Ended up not being built because the town ended up buying the property. But John, You've been on the ZBA when two of these projects have come across.
Correct. The Valentine Estate one and the UCC one. I was on the board and a voting member.
Yeah. So what's been your experience and perspective with those? So it's interesting to note. So the 133 West Union project is what we call an unfriendly 40B, meaning that had no town support. Whereas the UGC project, and actually the Robert Hill Way project, but the UGC project you're familiar with, is called a friendly 40B because it had select board support. But just with those caveats, sorry I interrupted you.
No, it's quite all right. They were two totally different processes. The Valentine Estate project that you said did not have town support. There were the developer proposed making significant changes to what basically was a wooded property. The hearing continued, I think, for well over a year.
Oh, yeah.
As there were requests for continuances on both sides. The town doesn't go into this, empty-handed and without support. We had town council at every meeting. The ZBA retained services of engineers, traffic consultants, et cetera, what's called peer review, to review what's being proposed by the developer. And we ultimately made a decision granting the comprehensive permit, but with a number of conditions. The developer was apparently unhappy with the conditions and appealed our decision to the Housing Appeal Agency, and that's where the matter was pending. And I can still recall sitting with the ZBA members in a small room in the basement of Town Hall while the matter was being adjudicated between the lawyers and a mediator, I think, that had been brought in
Right. Yeah.
to see if we could resolve it. And ultimately, it was resolved, and the town came to a decision to purchase the property, and that's why it still is a primarily wooded property.
Yeah, dilapidated farmhouse with a renovated barn. It took us a little while.
Someone will hopefully come along with an idea and,
Well, we got no shortage of ideas.
turn
It's
it
money.
into something that's profitable for all concerned. The UGC property, what you would call as a friendly 40B, did have support for the town. It was a different process because it was done over Zoom, because we were in the post-pandemic stage. It did not mean that there weren't changes to the developer's proposal, because the ZBA, working with the developer and the developer's engineer, made certain changes in the proposal. Particularly the one that comes to mind is the exit onto the roadway heading down to 126. There were concerns about people walking and not being able to have a sidewalk and whatnot, but ultimately it was approved, and we thought all was well. But then subsequently litigation was started by a third party, and things are on hold until that litigation is resolved. I think in both of those, both the unfriendly and the friendly, the ZBA has very limited ability to make changes. It's limited to certain areas of concern. All the issues that a proposed developer would have, which normally would go to before the planning board or the health commission or local ordinances under the Conservation Commission, all come before the ZBA, and the ZBA has the sole authority to decide on all of those issues, although we would certainly do so with the advice of the various town boards. But we really can't just say, oh, we don't like the project.
Right.
There has to be, we can perhaps change size, we can change the design, perhaps change the location of a building on the site, things of that nature, if it's supported by a sound basis.
You have to have evidence.
You have to have some evidence of why what the developer is proposing doesn't work. There is limited ability to question whether the project is financially feasible. And that's sort of at the end of the project, if we would ever get to that point. But it's not like the project comes before the ZBA like a special permit or a variance request where, all we're governed by is the zoning bylaws of the town of Ashland. Those are basically set aside.
Yeah, and I think, you brought up the Housing Appeals Committee, which is an important component here because, the question's going to be, as I'm sure people asked at 133 West Union Street, when you approved it with conditions. Well, John, if the community doesn't like the project, why approve it anyway? Why don't you just deny it? And the thing is that you can deny, the ZBA does have the ability to deny a project.
We do.
Right? But what happens at that point in time is that the developer has the opportunity to appeal to a state agency that's outside of the town's control called the Housing Appeals Committee. And basically, the developer's case is that, well, whatever, the denial is not right, or whatever condition, if they're, onerous conditions, they can even appeal the conditions that it's approved with and say that it's uneconomic. And what history has shown, and over 95% of the time, is that this Housing Appeals Committee, the state agency, overrules the local zoning board and basically lets these projects go through. And that is why it's designed.
If it's a complete denial of the application, the housing agency overrules the denial, and the project is approved exactly as it was presented by the developer.
With no changes.
No changes, nothing. And the reason why in these two specific proposals, we approved it with conditions was we were trying to make, speaking for myself, the best decision we could with what we thought were the most limitations we can put on the project to basically make the best of what we perceived as a bad situation. And hopefully the Housing Appeal Agency would see that, we weren't denying the project outright. We had conditions. Hopefully they would uphold those conditions. Perhaps they would uphold some, deny others. But in any event, the project wouldn't go forward 100% the way the developer wanted. There would be some changes which we thought made the project better and were within our power to make. But again, we go in and it's almost like you've got 1.5 hands tied behind your back because you can't start out with an even slate. You start out with the fact that there's a lot of housing is important, affordable housing is important. Ashland doesn't have 10% through other means, so we're forced to deal here we are, and as you mentioned, recently with two proposals before the state agency, we're sort of getting walloped all at once.
Yeah. So, Pete, why don't we turn our attention to these two proposals? So you've got the first one as located at the old mill site, Ashland Mills at 10 to 60 Main Street. It's called, is that one the Sanctuary?
The Sanctuary at Ashland Mills.
The Sanctuary at Ashland Mills. And then, literally a week after we got notified of that one, we got notified of a second one, which is on
the Oasis at Ashland.
Yeah, the Oasis. I love how they come up with these names.
Well, interestingly, the developer apparently has two previous projects, one in Plymouth and one Plainville,
yeah,
that are the Oasis at. So this perhaps is
fits the theme
that's going forward.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Pete, why don't you tell us a little bit about these two?
So the first project, Michael, that you mentioned is at the 10 to 50 Main, 10 to 60 Main, whatever, going by the addresses in the assessor's database. But that project is proposed for 250 units. Unlike other 40Bs, there's actually a commercial component to this 40B project, the commercial component that's being proposed is in the historical 10 Main Street. What commercial use, that has not really been determined and or set yet. However, it's been hinted that the developer would be looking to put in a restaurant in that area. There'd be other I think that's the biggest commercial user out of the space. I think it runs about the space in the proposal runs about 7,500 square feet. And then for the second project is the Oasis at Ashland, and that project proposes all residential with 226 units, and that's at on land which is kind of in a pie-shaped formation between Waverly Street and East Union Street. But just to know, access would just be out onto Waverly Street. It would not be accessing West Union across from the high school.
And so, as we mentioned earlier, there's a number of phases that these projects have to go through. And where are these projects right now in those respective phases?
So both projects are still in the beginning phases, right? They are still applying for what's known as an eligibility letter through a subsidized housing agency. Both projects are using Mass Housing as a subsidized housing agency, and so both projects are right now under review at Mass Housing. The town of Ashland has submitted a letter, a community comment letter regarding 10 to 60 Main Street, the sanctuary at Ashland Mills. However, the town is also in the period for the second project, the Oasis. We're still in our time period, and I'm sure the community will be putting together a letter for that project. And so, right now, there's been no permanent filings, and the project has not been received and or filed at the town level. And so. If the when the applicant gets an eligibility letter, then they would file with the town, and then I believe the town has 30 days to open up a public hearing. And so that is the kind of rough situation that we're in right now. And right now, obviously we'll wait and see what happens with both projects. If they do receive an eligibility letter, then they'll probably move forward. If they don't, I think maybe, that will kind of maybe end the conversation for now.
Right.
But,
right.
there's housing is a regional issue. The current administration is really focused on it.
Pushing it hard.
Pushing it hard. We've been, we as a town of Ashland that, we're looking at the MBTA zoning known as 3A.
Which is different than 40B.
Which is 100% different from 40B. But I would say across the board, across the state, Eastern Massachusetts, housing is a number one topic that planners talk about on a day in and day out basis. And we're trying to stay ahead of the curve, obviously, regarding these two, and then the 40B projects, but then also MBTA zoning.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, the mill project. So, that's something that Peter, I know you and I, and a lot of people. I mean, if you look studies going back to the early 2000s, and John, you're probably involved in some of these, the renovation of that site has always been kind of identified as a priority, as a way to kind of I guess revitalize our downtown area. And it's such a big site, and it's a gateway site, and we all know what the condition of it is right now, and it's not the best. And so, I think the renovation of that site has always been the key. And I think actually if you talk to anybody, they would be like, oh yeah, it'd be great if that was renovated. And then where people start diverging is, okay, but renovated into what? And, a lot of people in town, and I think we would agree, if it's feasible, like you could do, it would be awesome if it was majority of it commercial or a lot of it, commercial. But the fact is that's not where the economics are right now. And that's not what is getting financed and what's getting built. So we can say as a community all we want that, hey, you know what, we'd love to have, 50 units and the rest of it be like a commercial property. I mean, I'm speaking specifically to the one at the mill right now, but the thing is that nobody's going to build that and nobody is going to finance that. It has to have a heavy residential component. And so we've been really trying to work to try to find something that would be palatable for the community for that site. And I know the planning board last had the mill owner had gone to the planning board and was actually looking at permitting that site with something a little bit different, and ultimately decided, to go in this direction. But
Yeah, you're correct, Michael. I can speak to that real, quickly. Is that yes, the planning board did have an application in front of them, but a year ago. It was coming up on a year now. It was withdrawn this past September, right? So almost a year ago. But previously, the prior year, the planning board and the property owner were working on a project, and that project started off at 200 units with 25% affordability, and it had commercial space in the range of, I think it fluctuated anywhere from 25,000 square feet, anywhere north to about 32,000 square feet, right? That project at one point, within redesigns and going back and forth to try to, mold and manipulate and to massage a better project, those numbers then dropped down to 188 units with 15% affordability. Now with that, the town could not add all units onto the subsidized housing inventory, and then it kept about, I think it retained between 20 to 25,000 square feet of commercial space in the building. Now, working through that project and working with the owner, the property owner at the time, who was the applicant, when he was trying to look at financing the project that was in front of him, in front of the planning board, with the way the economy was going, with the interest rates going, north at that time, we were obviously at the 2.5% range, and then they obviously, with inflation, they rose quite dramatically. I think right now we're at the 7.5%. Also, in addition, construction costs, labor costs, material costs, the project that was there at that time was not feasible. Right, from a financial standpoint. And so then obviously the developer, the owner of the property, who was the developer, withdrew the project without prejudice from the planning board, and he obviously went back to the drawing board too. I think he wants to make an investment into that property. I think and to see the best use of his property, to see through with the best use of his property. And with, as a property owner, he has the ability to do that within his property rights. But yes, the planning board did work on a project. However, it didn't really work out into fruition, and it was not completed through that permitting process or that review process. And with that said, however, a project is back again in front of the planning board. A project is back again, not in front of the planning board, but right now with a subsidized, with a state agency, and could be in the future submitted to the Zoning Board of Appeals.
And I think it might be helpful to sort of recognize the mass housing when they consider whether or not to give approval to the developer, what they consider.
Right. Specified, very specified
It's very
criteria.
specified items. They look at whether the project is generally eligible for the 40B.
Right.
Is the site generally appropriate for what's being proposed? Is the conceptual project design generally appropriate for the site? Does the developer have control of the site? And is the project financially feasible? And those are all sort of very general, conditions. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether whether mass housing goes back to the developer with questions or what have you. Their mass housing's sort of informational site talks about a 90-day process from the date of their receipt of the documents to when they make a decision.
Sounds about right.
And we've gotten a 30-day extension of time on our 30-day comment period, so arguably maybe we're looking at 120 days. They're not bound by that. They can take as much time as they want, but that, in their handouts, that's what they sort of give as a guideline.
Yeah, we submitted that comment letter to Mass Housing for the mill site last Wednesday, I believe.
Okay.
So we'll be interested. And then we have until the 27th or the 29th of June for the other one.
Yeah, I think right now, obviously, we are as a town for the mill, for the Ashland Mills, we've submitted a comment letter, and now we're awaiting news, and to see how that project moves forward.
And if the projects are ultimately authorized by Mass Housing and are filed with the town, there are very specific time frames that the town has to abide by, or we run the risk of the proposal being automatically approved.
Yeah.
We have to schedule and can open a public hearing within 30 days of the date that the town received the documentation, and I believe the hearing has to be concluded within 180 days, although that period can be extended by agreement of the developer and the town. And my understanding, and talking with town council on other previous matters, that those extensions are usually granted by the parties.
Yeah, 100%. I think we do, when a project does come in, you have to abide by the timeline and the time frame set out in the statute. But yes, continuances are often granted throughout a permitting process. I think for the UGC project, which is on Memorial Drive, I think that took about, from the start to finish, wire to wire, I think we're probably like 6 to 8 months.
Yeah,
I would say in that time period, and obviously we're outside of the 180 days, but there's typically obviously with good faith, both parties do extend.
Yeah. All right, well, gentlemen, we're actually quickly running out of time. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that you have our listeners know?
Nope. I mean, just that in the event that we do receive a comprehensive permit application and there is a hearing opened, the public will be given an opportunity to speak at the public hearings.
Oh, that's good.
And
good information.
let their position be known. The board has been meeting via Zoom for the past several years, and we found it's worked very conveniently for us. With a 40B proposal, I think we may need to revisit that and begin meeting in person, just to make it easier for people to attend and be heard, but also for sharing of documents on the screens and what have you. But that's not something that the board has really discussed, but that's where my brain has been going.
Okay. And so right now, up on the planning website, the planning section of the town's website, we have information on both projects.
That's correct. So actually all projects in town that go through the planning office for either planning board and or zoning board, I'll take the time to plug that. All information is up on the website under the current projects page. And on that page, there are potential 40B applications, and the two that we stated today, the Oasis at Ashland and the Sanctuary at Ashland Mills, are both up there with information, with the full application that is submitted to Mass Housing, in the renderings and the site plan.
Excellent. Okay. Well, John, Peter, thank you so much to both of you for being willing to share your time today and your expertise and your experience on planning and 40B projects in particular. Obviously, this is going to be a pretty wild ride here in the town of Ashland for the next few months, just seeing where these projects go. As you mentioned, if Mass Housing denies their letter of eligibility, it kind of stops the process right there. If not, we have to move forward to the next step, which is the ZBA process. And John, you've done a good job of outlining some of those timeframes, but encourage everybody to stay engaged. Again, follow the town's website to get some information on that, on those projects. The ZBA hearings will be televised in person, Zoom. But you'll be able to speak. People who are interested will be able to watch, view, and attend and speak in some way, shape, or form throughout the process. So encourage you all to stay involved. But that is it for this episode of Clock Town Chronicles. If you have any questions or if you have any other things that you'd like us to talk about or comments, please email us at clocktownchronicles@ashlandmass.com. Looking over at Melissa, she's nodding her head that I did get the email address right, which is good. But anyway, it's been a pleasure to have you listening here today, and hopefully you've got some good information on things going on in the town, and we will see you for the next episode. I believe our next episode will be newly elected Select Board member Makita Keegan, who's going to come and talk to us about just kind of what her history of public service and what inspired her to run and what she's hoping to accomplish as part of the Select Board. So anyway, again, my name is Michael Herbert, Town Manager. Thank you again for listening, and have a good afternoon, everyone.